Everyone at the party laughed when the billionaire asked the maid's elderly mother if she wanted to try playing chess. She smiled politely, nodded, and sat down. No one knew that in just a few moves this old woman was about to destroy the billionaire's ego and reveal a secret past that would leave the whole room in stunned silence. It was a golden afternoon, the kind that made the sprawling gardens of the Wentworth estate shimmer like a dream. The estate, known for its vast marble fountains, rose gardens, and antique statues, was the pride of Charles Wentworth, one of the richest men in the state. With his steel-gray hair, crisp designer suits, and the kind of smile you only see in magazines, Charles had built an empire on investments, charm, and cold calculation. He threw parties often not out of love for people, but for power. If you were invited to a Wentworth gathering, it meant something. That sunny Saturday was no different. The estate buzzed with laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the soft hum of classical music drifting from hidden speakers across the lawn. Clarissa moved quickly and quietly through the crowd, dressed in a black maid's uniform, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres with practiced grace. She had worked for the Wentworth family for 6 years, and though her presence blended into the background, she was anything but ordinary. Her eyes were observant, her posture perfect, and her manners flawless. Charles liked her. She was respectful, never too chatty, and always on time. He knew very little about her personal life, just that she had a daughter in college and a mother who lived with her. It was only when Clarissa approached Charles, politely asking if her elderly mother could sit in the shade of the garden while she finished her shift, that anything out of the ordinary began. "Your mother, you say?" Charles said, glancing up from a conversation about crypto trends. "Bring her out. Let her enjoy the air. We're celebrating life, aren't we?" Clarissa was slightly surprised by the invitation but thanked him sincerely and returned with her mother. Esther Johnson, a short woman with soft brown skin, thick, white curls tucked neatly under a scarf, and the kind of eyes that had seen much and judged little. She walked slowly, with quiet dignity, using a cane that she didn't always need but carried anyway. Esther smiled kindly at everyone, folding her hands in her lap as she sat beneath a white parasol near the chessboard, a massive decorative feature Charles had installed for ambience, rarely used by guests who preferred wine and gossip to mental sports. Charles approached her minutes later with his signature grin and a glass of sparkling water. "You ever play chess, ma'am?" he asked playfully, nodding toward the board. "It's a game of kings and queens. Strategy, war. Though I warn you, I'm not half bad myself." A few nearby guests chuckled, watching with mild interest. It wasn't every day you saw the billionaire challenge an old lady to a match. Esther tilted her head, giving Charles a patient look, then smiled faintly. "I've played a few games in my time," she said. That was all the invitation Charles needed. He began setting the pieces with dramatic flair, explaining the rules as though she were a child. "The pawns go here. The queen protects the king. Rook moves in straight lines." "I remember," Esther said quietly, placing her cane aside. Clarissa stood frozen at a distance, balancing her tray, her heart tightening with nerves. She knew what this moment meant, even if no one else did. Her mother hadn't touched a chessboard in years, but Clarissa had grown up watching her play in her mind. When money was tight and power was far, chess was Esther's secret escape, her invisible garden. She would whisper moves to herself while folding laundry, challenge herself in the mirror, and solve newspaper puzzles faster than anyone Clarissa knew. Charles made the first move, his smile cocky. Esther responded in kind. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. Guests sipped their drinks and chatted lazily, but after a few moves, the tone began to shift. Charles leaned in, furrowed his brow. Esther was countering every attack with elegant, precise moves. A couple of guests wanted closer to the board, then more. The air grew still as the game unfolded, a quiet intensity replacing the earlier laughter. Clarissa didn't move. She couldn't. This wasn't just a game, it was her mother's life unspoken. Years of brilliance pushed aside by circumstance, now stepping into the sun. Within 15 minutes, Charles was visibly sweating. He tried bold plays, risky traps. Esther dismantled each one with calm grace. She didn't gloat, she didn't speak, she simply played as if breathing. The murmurs grew louder. Someone whispered, "He's losing." Another said, "Who is she?" Charles rubbed his temple, clearly irritated but trying to save face. "You've got some moves," he said through a forced chuckle. Esther finally tilted her head, reached out slowly and moved her queen with a feather-light touch. "Checkmate," she said. The crowd went silent. Charles stared at the board, his mouth slightly open. A flash of red crossed his cheeks. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then awkward clapping began, followed by real applause. Esther gently smiled, but her eyes didn't boast. They simply held peace. Clarissa stepped forward, her eyes glassy. Charles stood up, brushing off his jacket, clearly stunned. "Well, looks like I underestimated you," he mumbled, voice tight. Esther simply replied, "Most people do." Charles laughed nervously, trying to recover his pride. "Well, you've got talent, ma'am. Maybe we should have a rematch sometime." Esther nodded politely. "Maybe." As the guests slowly returned to their drinks and stories, The buzz of what had just happened spread like wildfire. Clarissa helped her mother up, whispering, "Mama, you did it." Esther patted her daughter's hand. "I just played a game, baby, that's all." But Clarissa knew better. Something had shifted. Not just in the crowd or in the way Charles looked at her mother, but in the air itself. It was the sound of history demanding to be seen, and this was only the beginning. By Sunday morning, the story had already started slipping out of the confines of the Wentworth estate, like wildfire escaping a matchstick. It wasn't just that a wealthy billionaire had been humiliated in front of his own guests, it was how it happened. The quiet elegance of an elderly black woman checkmating Charles Wentworth on his prized garden chessboard was too strange, too satisfying, too perfect for people to keep to themselves. It began with whispers. A partygoer mentioned it in a tweet. A video clip taken discreetly on a smartphone found its way to social media. "Watch what happens when this maid's mama takes down the chessboard king," the caption read. By the afternoon, the clip had been viewed over 50,000 times. By nightfall, it was everywhere. Clarissa first found out through her niece, who called in a frenzy, screaming, Auntie Grandma's on TikTok. She destroyed that rich guy." Clarissa, who had been trying to recover from the surrealness of the day before, couldn't believe it. She clicked the link, and there was the video's shaky close-up shots of Esther's .com face, Charles's growing panic, and the moment her mother's quiet checkmate fell like thunder in the garden. The comment section was exploding. Some viewers were shocked, some amused, and others deeply moved. "Who is she?" one comment asked. "She just unlocked a cheat code for life." Another said, "This lady is giving Queen's Gambit realness, and I love it." Esther, however, was blissfully unaware. She sat at the kitchen table that morning sipping her tea as if the world hadn't turned her into an internet icon overnight. She wore her same faded robe, the same calm expression. When Clarissa told her the news, she just chuckled softly and said, "Oh, I guess folks like a good surprise." That was all. She didn't care for fame, didn't seek attention. To her, the game was done. She had played and returned to her quiet, but the world had no intention of forgetting her that quickly. By Monday, a local news channel reached out for an interview. Clarissa was skeptical at first. She didn't want her mother being used as a novelty. "They just want to make you into a joke, Mama," she said. "A funny little story." But Esther smiled, touched her hand and said, "Let them talk. Maybe someone out there needs to know it's never too late to be seen." With that, Clarissa agreed. The interview was scheduled for Wednesday morning at the community library where Esther spent most of her time. The interview was gentle. The reporter was a young black woman named Simone who had grown up watching her grandfather play chess in a Harlem barbershop. She treated Esther not like a meme but like a legend. The two talked for nearly an hour. Esther told stories about her childhood in Georgia where she learned to play chess by watching white boys compete in the park. "They didn't let us girls play," she said, "and definitely not girls like me, but I watched, and I remembered." She spoke about how she never had money for boards or pieces, so she made them from bottle caps and cardboard. She explained how she used to challenge her own mind when no one else would play. "I used to say, white Esther versus black Esther, and let them fight it out." When the interview aired, it was raw and beautiful. Simone asked, "Why didn't you ever go professional?" Esther's answer silenced everyone who watched, because in those days, it didn't matter how smart you were, not when your skin wasn't the right shade and your bank account stayed empty. The clip spread even faster than the chess match. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. From housemaid's mother to chess queen, the genius, who stayed hidden, how America missed Esther Johnson. But with attention came pressure. Charles Wentworth, whose public image had taken a bruising, began receiving emails and calls from business partners and media advisors. He had tried to laugh it off, even posting a joke about getting schooled by a legend on his company's official page. But the public didn't forget easily. For many, he represented something bigger: arrogance, privilege, the casual dismissal of the poor and elderly. For others, it was about race and class, and the way Esther had symbolically turned the board around. On Thursday afternoon, Charles did something he rarely did. He called Clarissa directly. His voice was softer than usual, stripped of his usual confidence. "Clarissa," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about your mother, about the match, about everything." Clarissa held her breath. "I owe her an apology. A real one, not just for the game, but for the way I saw her before it." Clarissa wasn't sure how to respond. For years, she'd worked in his house, watching how invisible she and others like her had become. And now, the same man who barely noticed her was calling her because the world had finally seen her mother. Charles continued, "I want to meet her again properly, and I want to do something in her name. Maybe a chess scholarship, maybe a school program, I don't know yet, but I want it to come from a place of respect." Clarissa didn't promise anything. She said she'd talk to her mother. Esther, of course, listened quietly to the whole conversation and then said, "If he's serious, tell him I'll bring the chessboard this time." That night, Clarissa sat on the couch beside her mother, the glow of the television lighting the room. They watched a replay of the interview. Esther looked at her younger self on the screen, not with vanity, but with peace. "Funny," she said, "how a game I used to play in the dark now brought light." Clarissa leaned her head on her mother's. shoulder. You're not just a player, Mama, you're a storm wrapped in silk. Esther chuckled, then whispered, and you, baby, are the reason I never gave up. Outside, the world kept spinning. Inside, something sacred had been restored, and far beyond what either of them could see. Thousands of girls, poor unseen, brown-skinned girls, watched the video of Esther Johnson and believed, for the first time, that they too could play the game and win. It was a week after the viral storm when Esther Johnson found herself walking carefully, slowly through the heavy glass doors of the Metropolitan Chess Association headquarters downtown. The invitation had come in a cream-colored envelope with a gold seal and a letter so formal, Clarissa had to read it twice to make sure it wasn't a joke. We would be honored, the letter read, if Ms. Esther Johnson could attend our annual legacy luncheon as a guest of distinction. For an organization that had, for decades, catered to grandmasters, elite players, and chess scholars with long pedigrees and expensive coaching, the offer was unheard of. And yet, there she was, wearing a navy blue dress Clarissa had picked out, walking into a building that had once seemed as far away from her life as the moon. Clarissa walked beside her, proudly holding her mother's arm. Her hands were trembling, slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming gravity of what this moment meant. The room was grand, high ceilings, marble floors, chandeliers that sparkled like frozen stars. People stopped mid-conversation to look at them, some with admiration, others with curiosity. A few whispered, "That's her," like they were seeing a living myth. Esther, unfazed, moved like water, calm, steady, untouched by the noise. She had spent her whole life being invisible in places like this. Today, they had no choice but to see her. The luncheon was held in the Hall of Champions, a long room with portraits of famous chess players framed in gold. Most of the faces were white, male, and stern. Esther glanced at them and smiled faintly, as if saying, "Nice to meet you, boys." At the center table, a nameplate awaited her, Miss Esther Johnson, honored guest. Clarissa's eyes filled with pride. Just months ago, they'd been worrying about utility bills and the rising price of groceries. Now her mother's name sat beside world-renowned grandmasters. It didn't erase the past, but it made a mark. A seat at the table was more than symbolic, it was long overdue. During the event, people approached Esther one by one, some with curiosity, others with genuine reverence. An elderly European master told her, "Your instincts in that viral game remarkable. You saw traps 3 moves ahead." A young Nigerian-American prodigy whispered, "I showed your video to my grandmother. She cried." An old woman in pearls and diamonds leaned down and asked Esther if she'd ever considered writing a book. Esther, who still wrote her grocery lists on the back of church bulletins, just laughed and said, "Maybe one day if I can borrow someone's laptop." Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. A tall man in a crisp tuxedo took the stage and introduced her. In a world where genius is often hidden by poverty, prejudice, or simply time, it is our privilege to honor a woman who has reminded us that brilliance does not expire. The crowd applauded as Esther rose from her chair, walking to the podium slowly but steadily. She didn't have a speech written. She didn't need one. "I was told once," she began, her voice soft but clear, "that chess was a game for the gifted. I always believed it was a game for the patient. I never had trophies. I never had coaches. I had silence, and I had struggle, but I also had something they couldn't take from my imagination. When I couldn't afford pieces, I made them. When I wasn't allowed to play, I watched and learned. I played games in my head when my hands were busy scrubbing floors. I didn't play for applause, I played to stay alive inside." There was a stillness in the room, a quiet so deep that even the servers paused. Clarissa's hand clutched the edge of the table, her heart beating faster with every word. "I don't need medals," Esther continued. "I don't need interviews or hashtags, but if there is one thing I do want, it is this. Let no little black girl with a brilliant mind ever be told she's too late, or not enough, or out of place. Let her know she can sit at this table, not as a guest but as a champion." The applause that followed wasn't polite, was thunderous, raw, and real. Some stood, some wiped tears. For once, the people in that room weren't applauding for status or success. They were applauding for truth, for a story that had been buried and now stood tall in the light. After the luncheon, a flurry of offers followed. A publisher reached out about writing a memoir. A documentary team pitched a feature called Queen, Without a Crown. A tech startup offered to sponsor online chess lessons with Esther as the face of the campaign. Clarissa handled most of it, becoming her mother's unofficial manager overnight. Esther took it all in stride, saying yes to a few things and kindly declining others. She didn't want her story sold like a fairy tale. She wanted it respected. Meanwhile, Charles Wentworth kept his promise, quietly, without the need for public praise. He donated a large sum to start the Esther Johnson Chess Fellowship, a program for underprivileged youth to receive chess training, equipment, and mentorship. He even came to visit Esther again, this time at her home, with no press, no gifts, just a sincere expression of gratitude and humility. Esther served him sweet tea and asked if he wanted a rematch. He laughed and said, "Only if you're feeling generous." Life didn't change overnight. Esther still preferred her modest routines, her garden, her gospel music. her quiet evenings, but something had shifted. She had been seen not just as a fluke or a viral wonder, but as a woman who had carried genius quietly through the decades. She had endured, and now she had inspired. One evening, Clarissa found her mother at the kitchen table again, the same place she used to sit in silence years ago. But this time, the table had a polished chessboard on it, gifted by a young fan who carved it by hand. Esther was replaying her favorite game, the one against Charles, smiling as she moved the pieces. "You thinking of retiring from the spotlight already?" Clarissa teased, leaning on the doorway. Esther looked up, her eyes twinkling. "Child, I never joined the spotlight. I just brought a little light of my own." And with that, she moved her queen once more across the board, across time, across every closed door that had ever dared to tell her no. The glory was sweet, yes, but not without weight. As Esther Johnson's story continued to bloom in public view, with each invitation, interview, and praise-filled article, something stirred quietly inside her. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret, it was memory. The past, once buried deep beneath years of labor and sacrifice, was beginning to wake up. Fame had a strange way of digging up the things you'd long since learned to live without. For Esther, that meant opening the door to chapters of a life she'd spent decades trying to forget, places and people that once told her she'd never be more than a maid's daughter. Never more than someone who cleaned up after dreams. She wasn't allowed to have doubt. It began one evening as she sifted through old boxes in Clarissa's garage. A journalist had asked if she had any childhood photos or personal records for a chess magazine feature. And Esther, reluctant but curious, had agreed to look. She hadn't touched those boxes in years. Dust covered them like time's apology. She opened one gently, revealing old church bulletins, yellowed family portraits, school report cards, and tucked deep at the bottom a worn cloth chessboard. The fabric was faded, but she recognized it instantly. Her heart tightened. It was the same board she'd stitched together in her teens, using scraps from her mother's sewing work. The pawns were mismatched buttons. The kings and queens were carved from discarded spools of thread. It had been her sanctuary, that little board, a place where she could pretend that the rules made sense, that hard work equaled progress, and that the smartest player could win even if the world outside said otherwise. She held it to her chest and sat down on the floor of the garage, letting the silence wrap around her. And then the memories came. She was 16 again, sitting under the pecan tree in her grandmother's backyard in Macon, Georgia. It was summer, and the air was thick with heat and dust. A boy named Marcus sat across from her, laughing, his legs crossed, a carved chess piece in his hand. Marcus was the first one to truly see her, not as a burden or a house girl, but as a mind. "You're gonna whip the world with this brain," he'd tell her. They used to play for hours, him always losing but never minding. He had dreams of moving north, joining the civil rights movement, becoming a journalist. They had made a pact, sitting in that yard to rise, to matter, to win at life, not just chess. But Marcus had vanished the summer of '68, caught in a protest gone wrong, beaten by police, arrested, and never seen again. Esther never even got to say goodbye. No letters came. No one gave answers. His disappearance had broken something in her. That was when she stopped playing with others, retreating into herself and the silent games she played only in her mind. Now, sitting in a garage in 2025, her fingers touching the worn fabric of her youth, the tears came not for fame or lost time but for the boy who taught her to believe. She wished he could see her now. "I didn't forget Marcus," she whispered. "I made it. We made it that night." Esther didn't sleep. She stayed up at the kitchen table, not playing chess this time, but writing. Clarissa awoke to find pages scattered across the table owed memories. Names, moments written in careful looping handwriting. "Mama," she said gently, "what are you doing?" Esther didn't look up. "I'm writing it all down. Not for magazines, not for speeches, for us, for the ones who never made it. I can't just be a face on a screen. I have to tell the whole truth, all of it." In the days that followed, Clarissa watched her mother transform again. Not into someone new, but someone more complete. She agreed to a televised interview not just about the viral match, but about the South, about racism, about what it meant to be brilliant and black and female in a world that pretended not to see. She talked about Marcus, about her father, who disapproved of chess because it was a white man's game, about the women in her church who whispered behind her back, calling her proud when she refused to lower her eyes, about the jobs she worked, scrubbing floors and offices, where the men played chess in their break rooms and never once invited her. "I watched their games while cleaning their ashtrays," she said, "and beat every single one of them in my head." The interview aired on national television, and this time the reaction wasn't just viral, it was letters poured in, not emails, letters handwritten. From elderly men who once knew Marcus, from women who played chess in secret, from young girls who felt seen for the first time. One letter came from a retired teacher in Alabama. "I taught for 32 years and never once saw a black girl win the school chess tournament. I think it's because they never knew they could, until now." But not all responses were kind. With fame came scrutiny. A political commentator dismissed her as a media puppet, claiming the viral video was staged. Another online voice mocked her old age saying she didn't deserve the title of genius. Esther, for the most part, ignored them, but Clarissa fumed. Why do they always try to knock down what they don't understand? She snapped one day, slamming her phone down. Esther gently touched her hand and said, because people fear truth when it doesn't look like them, let them fear. We've got work to do. And work they did. Esther partnered with schools, started community chess circles, and spoke to rooms of girls who looked just like she once had, small, unseen, full of brilliance, with nowhere to shine. She didn't want to be remembered as the maid's mama, who beat the billionaire. She wanted to be the reason a girl chose to pick up a chess piece instead of laying down her dreams. One quiet evening, Esther and Clarissa walked through the park. Children played nearby, one of them sitting cross-legged with a small, plastic chessboard, a girl about 10, brown skin, focused eyes. Esther slowed down, watching her. The girl noticed and smiled. You're her, aren't you? She asked. Shyly, Esther nodded. I am. The girl looked back at her board. Wanna play? Esther paused, smiled warmly, and sat down in the grass beside her. As the game began, Clarissa stood back watching the billionaire's garden, the applause, the headlines. None of it mattered now. This, right here, was the real legacy. One game, one girl, one spark passed forward. Esther didn't need a crown. She was already royalty, ruling, not with a scepter, but with a mind that had survived silence and bloomed in the sun. Months passed like pages in a book no one wanted to end. Esther Johnson had become more than a name. She was a movement. From community centers in Atlanta to chess clubs in Chicago, from classrooms in Detroit to public parks in Brooklyn, the story traveled with a power she hadn't intended but fully embraced. She was no longer just the maid's mama who beat the billionaire. She had become a symbol of resilience, of brilliance, long ignored, of possibilities that existed quietly in people the world passed by. And yet, through it all, Esther remained, herself humble, grounded, and still most comfortable in her kitchen with a warm cup of tea and an old gospel song humming from the radio. It was early spring when the invitation came, a final one, and perhaps the most significant of all, the International Chess Federation, a body that had once been entirely out of reach for someone like Esther, was holding a ceremony in New York to honor legends who changed the game. Alongside world champions, grandmasters, and inventors of famous strategies, they had carved out a place for her. Not for her rating, she had none. Not for tournament wins, she had never played in one, but for impact, for inspiration, for proof that genius doesn't require a spotlight, only a chance. Clarissa read the letter aloud, trying to hold back emotion. Esther sat silent for a long moment, eyes fixed out the window. Then she nodded and said softly, I guess it's time for one last game. The trip to New York felt surreal. They traveled by train, Esther choosing it over a flight because she wanted to see the country one more time, not fly over it. Along the way, she stared out at small towns and old stations, remembering the life she could have had, the games never played, and the dreams that somehow, after all this time, had found their way back to her. The ceremony was grand, held in a historical auditorium lined with flags, chandeliers, and cameras flashing like fireflies. Esther, in a royal purple dress stitched by a local seamstress who had watched her rise with pride, walked slowly to the stage when her name was called. The room stood. The applause was thunderous. This time it wasn't for a viral video. It wasn't for a curious underdog story. It was for a legacy. As she stood at the microphone, Esther didn't speak with dramatic flair. Her voice was gentle, steady, like someone telling you something you already knew but had forgotten. All my life, she said, I thought I had to play in silence. I thought the game belonged to someone else. I thought brilliance had a face, a name, a skin tone. That wasn't mine, but I was wrong. Brilliance belongs to anyone who refuses to give up on their mind, on their hope, on their story. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. I am not the best player in the world. I may not even be the best in this room, but I am proof that you do not need permission to be powerful. You only need a board and the courage to sit down at it. The audience stood again. Some cried, some clapped, some just closed their eyes, letting the truth settle into the spaces it had been missing for too long. After the ceremony, Esther and Clarissa were taken to a private hall where a surprise awaited them, a new initiative called Esther's Table, a program where retired chess masters, especially women of color, would be funded to mentor underprivileged youth in underserved schools. Clarissa gasped when she saw her mother's name engraved on the plaque. Esther simply touched the cool metal and whispered, "Now that's a real trophy." In the weeks that followed, life began to slow again. The public attention started to fade, but its echo lived on in libraries, chess clubs, and living rooms where people played differently now, with more hope, more belief, more room for others. One warm Sunday afternoon, back home in Georgia, Clarissa brought her daughter Esther's granddaughter, Lillian, to the living room. The girl, barely 8, held a tiny chessboard in her hands and said, "Grandma, can you teach me?" Esther looked at her, eyes gleaming. She had waited her whole life for this moment, not the applause, not the awards, but this, a child of her own blood, asking for a piece of the wisdom she had once buried beneath years of silence. She nodded. Of course, baby. Let me show you something special. They sat on the carpet. Esther explained each piece, not just how it moved, but why. The rook moves straight because life sometimes needs you to be bold, she said. The knight jumps because sometimes you've got to take the path no one expects, and the queen goes everywhere because that's what real power looks like. Lily listened, wide-eyed. Clarissa watched from the couch, her heart full, knowing this was more than just a lesson. It was the continuation of something timeless, a story that had taken decades to unfold and now found itself planted in fresh soil. As the game went on, Esther let Lily win the first match, then the second. On the third, she moved her queen with a smile and whispered, "Check." Lily grinned. "I'll get you next time." Esther laughed. "I hope you do." That night, after the dishes were washed and the lights turned low, Esther sat alone by the window, looking out at the moon. The chessboard sat quietly on the table beside her, the pieces still in place. She thought about the journey, how a simple game had carried her through poverty, heartbreak, invisibility, and finally, victory, not the kind measured in medals, but in meaning. She thought of Marcus, of her grandmother, of every moment she'd doubted herself. She thought of the billionaire who'd once laughed, and how he, too, had changed. She thought of the girls across the country who now played without shame. She thought of Lily, her little hands moving pawns like they were poetry, and she smiled. In chess, as in life, the game ends not with chaos, but with clarity. A single move, a final position, a quiet understanding. Esther had made her move, and the world would never be the same if this story moved you. Don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard.